Let me first thank the organizers and sponsors of the side event for the occasion of the World Down Syndrome Day. It is my privilege to be a part of it. Fighting inequality, discrimination, and in turn favoring inclusion are the most meaningful and the most challenging realities and goals for all persons with disabilities, including those with Down syndrome. In 2006, on December 13, the United Nations adopted the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The first international framework has been launched with the aim to protect, ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities and promote respect to their inherent dignity. The main message of the Convention to the state parties is that all persons with disabilities, regardless of the impairment, are entitled to the full spectrum of human rights and fundamental freedoms without any discrimination. To that end, the Convention promotes the full participation of all persons with disabilities in all spheres of life, challenging customs, stereotypes, prejudice, harmful practice, and stigma relating to persons with disabilities. The Convention explicitly defines how to understand the concept of disability based on human rights, also defines what disability-based discrimination is, and further it anchors the rights of all persons with disabilities in relation to the obligation of the state parties of the Convention. But before going a little bit deeper into the provision of the Convention, let me refer to a critical cinema, which can be a great vehicle for raising awareness on the levels of discrimination that persons with Down syndrome face and the scope of social inclusion. I would like to recur to the movie The Grown-Ups, or Los Niños in original, by Matteo Alberdi, the movie which perfectly represents the structural barriers that face persons with Down syndrome in our societies. At first glance, everything looks perfectly. Everybody happy. Persons with Down syndrome live and work in perfect institutions, have work activities and freedom of movement as well as empowering personnel. But very structural barriers emerge when persons with Down syndrome are grown up and are ready for the adulthood, for life as adult person. They try to sell their job products just in expecting for goodwill of neighbors, but are rejected by them. They learn that money that they earn are for a pittance and is sufficient for independent life. They encounter both by state and by their families the refusal and illegitimacy to marry. Ricardo says, "I want a normal life I have never had before, but there is no right, no support mechanism for independent life for them, for us, for adult persons. Persons with Down syndrome, even adults by age, are still across all countries maintained in a very childhood condition, in special segregated schools outside of normal work contracts and work conditions. Normal payment are dependent on family or guardians' decisions. Adults are equipped with children's attributes such as Barbie as birthday gift, as we see in this movie. As a member of the Committee on Rights of Persons with Disability, which considers the state parties' reports and alternatives reports by organizations of persons with disabilities, I would like to raise some concerns and relevant recommendations in regard to the implementation of the rights of persons with disabilities worldwide. Persons with disabilities, whatever their disability, undergo a long history of inequality, discrimination, and invisibility. Persons with disabilities, including Down syndrome, worldwide have been beyond mainstream work relation, education, social and political life. They have been denied of access to mainstream schools, to open labor market, and placed in specialized settings outside of mainstream communities and societies, or left alone without support on their own, or mostly in families. Pathways that remain for persons with disabilities are between a life in segregated institutions or a life solely within family, but outside the community. The committee observes the comprehensive lack of understanding of the human rights model of disability in the state parties of the Convention, despite 10 years of its adoption. The committee observes that disability-related policies, legislation, and practice continue to be shaped by medical, in other words, individual pathology model or charity model. Both models focus on the degree of impairment of persons, on the incapacity to work, to the capacity to independent living. Persons with disabilities have been and still are continuously devaluated, labeled as being incapable, unable, special, dangerous, unsound mind, invalid, needing charity. And it is still persistent nowadays. National policies are missing disability perspective, targets and measures for inclusions of persons with disability, including with Down syndrome. Institutionalization is often the sole option for persons with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities without support and access to mainstream services on an equal footing with others. Living in institutions is a form of segregation and exclusion because of being separated of the communities, independent condition, instead of independent and ordinary life as other persons can live. The committee finds also that some state parties still focuses on disability prevention. Some states invest in the prenatal diagnostic of disability, prevention of impairments that perpetuate negative stereotypes about disability and are not in line with the recognition of persons with disabilities as full citizens and human rights holders. This is especially relevant to persons with genetic conditions, including persons with Down syndrome. National legislations and legal frameworks are still not providing for the full social inclusion and social participation of persons with disabilities, a broad extent. Gaps in national legislation with regard to the rights stipulated in the Convention are regularly monitored, identified, and addressed effectively. Disability-related laws often fails to include obligations for accessibility, reasonable accommodation, including sanctions for discrimination. Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability heralds a new epoch in the way persons with disabilities are treated throughout the whole community. The Convention at the global level has legitimated radical paradigm shift of disability from charity and medical disability models to human rights-based disability models, which means elimination of all barriers that may hinder full and effective participation of persons with disabilities in society. The concept of disability under the Convention embraces all persons with disabilities, with all disabilities, including persons with intellectual disability, persons with genetic and neurological conditions, with rare and chronic diseases, and all those who face barriers and discrimination because of their disability. The Convention proclaims very clearly that discrimination of persons with disabilities is not an arm. By ratifying the Convention, the state parties obligate to promote, to protect, and ensure rights of persons with disabilities. What rights and what obligations? There are several articles of the Convention that target civil and political rights of persons with disabilities. I would like to draw your attention to 3 of them, because I consider those rights are one of the most challenging. Article 12 recall to the obligation of the state party to recognize that all persons with disabilities enjoy legal capacity on a legal basis with others in all aspects of life. Today, thousands of persons with disabilities in all countries are fully or partially deprived of the legal capacity. The denial of legal capacity to persons with disabilities leads to the deprivation of many fundamental rights, including the right to vote, the right to marry, to found a family, as well as reproductive rights and parental rights. Legal capacity is indispensable for the exercise of all civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. As a member of the committee, I recall to the state parties' obligations to provide persons with disabilities with the support in the exercise of the legal capacity, support that respect the rights, wills, and preferences of persons with disability, and should never amount to substituted decision-making. Article 29 recalls to the obligations of the state parties to ensure that persons with disabilities can effectively and fully participate in political and public life on an equal basis with others. The committee is always concerned about the lack of accessibility to electoral processes and materials for persons with intellectual disabilities. The committee recommends that state parties guarantee the right to vote independently by ensuring that voting materials are accessible and easy to use when it comes to persons with disabilities, intellectual disabilities especially. There are more articles of the Convention which relate to economic, social, and cultural rights of persons with disabilities. Here I would like to draw your attention to some of them. Article 24 is an obligation for inclusive education, but it's still a critical issue. In most countries, segregated special education prevails. Children with disabilities, including with Down syndrome, still receive education in special schools. It is an obligation of the state parties under the convention to respect and fulfill the rights to inclusive education. Learners with intellectual impairments must be provided with concrete, observable, and visual and easy-read teaching and learning materials within a safe, quick, and structured learning environment, targeting capacities that will best prepare students for independent living and vocational context. Article 19, independent living and inclusion in the community. State parties must phase out institutionalization and ensure full access to all services offered to the public and support services offered to persons with disabilities. Article 27 of the Convention obliges the state parties to work and employment of persons with disabilities in an open labor market. Most of persons with disabilities are employed in sheltered workplaces or unemployed under poverty line. Sheltered workshops or unemployment both lead to segregation. Obligations by the state parties under the Convention is to ensure accessibility of labor market when making it open and inclusive for all persons with disabilities. To conclude, the Convention changed the status and role of persons with disabilities, including those with Down syndrome, from being medical and charity objects into active actors and human rights holders. The Convention obliged the state parties to eliminate all barriers and to provide with human rights-based legislation, specific measures, adequate support, accessibility, and reasonable accommodation to ensure the full social inclusion of persons with disabilities in societies and the full and equal social participation in ensuring their civil, political, economic, cultural, and social rights. Thank you.